you guys, it's Karen. I thought I would come and chat to you about Dad's prison life. I know that a lot of you were interested in hearing about it, particularly on the Life as a Zebra channel, but this video will go up on Patreon. He is always very open, and I know that he will have no issue with me doing this video because I can actually, I'll try and remember and put a link for you to his testimony, which is on YouTube, and that is him talking about his life.
My name's Alan. I'm a member here at Destiny Church, and for a few minutes I've got the privilege of sharing what Jesus means to me. During the war, my parents were divorcing, and they decided on one more night together, and I was the unwanted result. Age 4, my mother then remarried to a violent stepfather, and at age 7, my older brother, who had continually bullied me, started raping me. By the time I was 8, I was unable to talk and had violent nightmares and was sent to an asylum for 6 months. At 14, I was sent to a special school near Aberdeen, but was sent home after 6 months because I couldn't settle. Then at 15, I got caught stealing cigarettes and was thrown out of home. My mother contacted my father, who I didn't know existed, and was sent to him. He just took me on a pub crawl and sent me back home. Then began the downhill spiral through probation, youth prison, and then finally adult prisons for stealing and violence mostly. In prison in the early years, I was still bullied and raped, and this led to finally being charged with attempted murder, but got away with GBH and a 2.5-year sentence. I was sent to a semi-open prison aged about 23, where meals were taken in a mess hall. In the hall, a guy prayed over his meal, and the surprise was that no one took the mickey. And as I watched him, he had the respect of prisoners and wardens alike. He had such a love in his heart, everyone went to him with their troubles. I had searched many religions looking for love, but his advice to me was to disregard what others had filled my head with and just read about Jesus for myself. And I did. And wow, here was love, its very self. One thing I found difficult to accept, though, was Jesus forgiving those who had murdered him, until a light bulb moment. I was the one that was filled with bitterness and hatred. I was the one in prison in more ways than one. And when I forgave those who had hurt me, I also received forgiveness and was free to be filled with love. So his laws were the guide to live by. But is he real? 2 weeks before discharge, just before Christmas, I heard my girlfriend had married someone else, and the prison had to find me a halfway house somewhere in England. They found one in Coventry, just a few streets away from Michael, the guy who had introduced me to Jesus in prison. And those coincidences just keep on happening. I have known God's love and direction ever since, through good and bad times. One of the greatest times was that first Christmas, celebrating Jesus' birthday, who was now so personal to me, and it wasn't just a carol service. Thank you very much.
He's such an open person, and he would talk about his prison life, and he'd say things like, oh, I don't like that because it reminds me of prison, you know. Some people's mouths would drop open if they didn't know, you know. There's 2 stories from his life in prison that I feel are really impactful and terrifying, to be honest. The first one is he told me about his cellmate. My dad was on the bottom bunk, and he had a cellmate on the bunk above him. And he said being in prison was above all boring, you know, and he said there was nothing to do. And especially for my dad, who never slept well at night, he's always been an insomniac. And so he said they would kind of play silly games, and he said they would do this thing between him and his cellie. He would wake up in the middle of the night, get up, and he'd wake him up, and he'd say, quick, wake up. And the guy would be like, what is it? And he'd say, do you want to buy a battleship? And the guy would be like, oh my God, go back to sleep, you know. So my dad would go to sleep, and then his cellmate would wake him up and be like, quick, wake up. And he'd be like, what is it? how much do you want? And this would go backwards and forwards, you know, and they would play these sort of jokes on each other, and then he'd wake him up and go, 500, I'll give you 500, you know, silly things like that. So he was saying he was very close to this guy. And my dad was telling us this story because he was trying to illustrate how devastating it was when somebody split up with you in prison and you were in prison. And that's what my mum had done to him, I believe. And he was asleep one night and he woke up and he could feel liquid on him. And what had happened is his cellmate had killed himself. He'd cut his own wrists and he was bleeding through the top bunk onto my dad. And it turned out he had been dumped by his girlfriend. And that was a story that just shocked me to my core, you know, that I remember for quite a while after my dad told me that, I couldn't watch any films about prisons or anything to do with prisons. I couldn't watch. My brother's been in prison as well, and you know that had its own traumatic outcomes, and that I went to visit him, and that was very upsetting for me. But so that with what my dad told me, I couldn't watch anything about prisons. You know, I found it really upsetting to think of my dad in prison and going through something like that. So that was one of the stories that stuck out. And the other one was he was telling me about how corrupt prisons were, you know, and how you could basically do and get anything you want. And, you know, but he was quite friendly with a lot of the guards. And he had one guard that used to say to him, you know, I know your missus is coming in a couple of days. Let me know if you want us to get anything in for you, and I'll just make sure I'm standing near you and turning a blind eye, or, you know, or not checking her as she comes in or whatever. But there was this one particular time where there was a guy in for being a paedophile, and my dad was saying that was just unacceptable in prison, you know. Probably everybody knows that, don't they? And so this guy was believed to be a paedophile, and my dad was in isolation. Actually, there's another funny story about isolation. He said he was put in isolation a lot because he always got in trouble in prison as well. You know, he had his tattoos and everything in prison. But he always got in trouble, he always got put in isolation. He said this one time he got somebody to sneak him in a little cigarette, and he said he'd got a tiny little bit of a matchbox and one match that this guy had managed to sneak in when delivering his food. And so he was so excited about having this cigarette. He lit the match, but I don't know why he was standing over the toilet. I think he was going to flush it away as soon as he'd had, you know, have a few draws and flush it away. And he said, but he struck the match, dropped it into the toilet. So he had nothing to light this little bit of cigarette, and he knew he couldn't keep it because he'd get searched and whatnot, you know. And he was like, I just couldn't believe it. I was so devastated. I was like, oh no, that would be extremely frustrating. Anyway, he's in isolation, and you get haircuts in isolation, and somebody had come in to, like the hairdresser had come in, who was an inmate, to give him to shave his head, basically. And he said, but in the cell next to my dad, also in isolation for his safety, was this paedophile. And so he said the guard had come, opened the door, let the hairdresser in, and he was shaving my dad's head. But then the guard had come to the door, gave the hairdresser a nod, and he said to my dad, hold the clippers. The hairdresser guy went next door, the guard had opened the cell next door, beat the paedophile to death, came back through with blood all over him, and took the clippers off my dad and continued finishing his hair. And I was just like, were you not terrified? You know, how is that not terrifying? And he said, my dad said it is. He said, but I was used to that way of living. You know, that's the way it was in prison. But also, he said, I was quite terrified myself in a way. So it wasn't, he knew nobody would mess with him, and he wasn't a paedophile or anything like that, you know, so there was nothing really for him to fear. But it was another one of those stories that just stuck with me, and I was like, oh my God, like how, I wonder if that guard got found out, you know, because there's no other way that, you know, so that surely they knew it was the guard. And I don't understand corruption. You know, my brother's told me some stuff about it as well, and I'm like, I just don't understand how they get away with it. It just doesn't make sense. Like, okay, I know that this guy was crooked, this guard was crooked, or screw as my dad called him, but surely not everybody was crooked. So how did he not get punished for that? You know, how did that go unnoticed? I don't get it. But it was something that just those two stories really struck me as how horrific it is in prison, you know. So that's everything I think to tell you about what I can remember anyway. I'm sure there'll be other things that come back to me. My dad has told me a lot of stories about prison, so you know, if I remember anything else, I'll come back and do a part 2. But I think so. Yeah, like I said, I suppose I hope you find that interesting, but not. I hope that you don't judge too much, because yeah, he judged himself, and through all of that, you know, he was still my dad and he was still my hero. And times are different now. I would tell you, prison is very different now to it was when he was there. And you know, I'm not saying at all that he never deserved prison. He said he did. He said actually his turning point was when he stopped blaming others and realised he'd got himself into these situations, you know. So yeah, that's everything. Thank you very much for listening, and I will speak to you again soon.